Order!
O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Good morning, members. Minister's statement. Minister Quitlan Goodan and the Minister Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, the Government of the Northwest Territories recognize the need to advance the territorial vision of land and resource management in accordance with the Land Use and Sustainability Framework. And we have made a mandate commitment to evolve our legislative, regulatory and policy systems to develop and proposing a variety of acts, including the Mineral Resource Act. The Northwest Territories has mineral potential that could position itself as a primary economic driver for our country. The Government of Northwest Territories is committed to responsibly managing the Northwest Territories' resources and passing Made in the North legislation. Mr. Speaker, in the coming days, we will introduce the Northwest Territories' first Mineral Resource Act. This proposed act is the accumulation of years of research, public engagement, collaboration with Indigenous governments and organizations, and consistent engagement with industry and other interested stakeholders. Mr. Speaker, first and foremost, this legislation is a foundation upon which our management of mineral industry can be built. Its defining goal is to give our government the ability to respond to the wants and needs of our people, bring clarity and certainty where it is lacking, and modernizing how we govern mineral resources. These authorities will give us the ability to set regulations to match those ambitions and remove existing legislation barriers. The proposed act would allow the Northwest Territories to regulate minerals effectively, efficiently, and transparently. It could provide benefits for people and communities of the Northwest Territories and Indigenous governments and support our economic interests by ensuring wealth generation by mineral resources are used to benefit our territory as generations to come. It will also encourage positive relationships between all parties, improve geological knowledge of our territory, complete our existing system of land and natural resource management, recognize sustainable land use. It is designed to achieve these ends while ensuring respect for Aboriginal and treaty rights. Mr. Speaker, it will define a vision for managing exploration and mining in a way that makes sure NWT residents benefit, fosters positive relationships, and advances the public interest while maintaining a balanced approach for all. I would like to share some brief examples of why it is this way. Contained in the proposed act for the first time in Canada, provisions that will ensure benefits for Indigenous governments and organizations for major mining projects. This proposed act also addresses the benefits generating tools for NWT residents. It will clarify an approach that has existed and practiced through our social economic agreements and provided the flexibility to use other tools we see appropriate to generate benefits for the territory. Mr. Speaker, Indigenous governments, communities, public government, and those looking to do business here will all find measures in this proposed act that will benefit them as they work to build a mutually beneficial relationship with the mining industry. Through the proposed act, we hope to encourage early engagement, better communication, predictable dispute resolutions. We are also proposing a process to reduce conflict by addressing gaps around sensitive lands and local awareness amongst those exploring for minerals. The proposed act will enable our exploration regime to move into the 21st century with online map staking. This will actually help facilitate improved communication and transparency once implemented. Finally, we recognize that geological information is key to much of it collected through mineral exploration to mining activities. We will be proposing the ability to collect more geological information through all stages of the mineral development cycle. Such measures would add to our understanding of the territory's complex geology and could encourage economic development in the future, while also respecting the need for responsible confidentiality to protect commercial interests. Mr. Speaker, I can assure you the Government of Northwest Territories recognizes how important it is for NWT residents to access information about our legislation. That's why the Department of Industry, Tourism and Investment plans to release public awareness materials, and I hope to work with regular members to support a full understanding that we hope and the intent of this proposed act to achieve. We are encouraging Northwest Territories residents to visit our website, get acquainted with the details of our proposal, and take part as this proposed act moves through the legislative process. Mr. Speaker, I am proud how far we've come, but understand there's more work to come. The proposed Mineral Resource Act addresses the need for a modern, clear, competitive legislative and regulatory framework that responds to the needs of the Northwest Territories and its investment partners. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister's statement. Minister Ike Godin and the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Government in Northwest Territories has a mandate commitment to use the Land Use and Sustainability Framework to establish the Tyendinaene protected areas in partnership with the Indigenous Government and the Government of Canada. I can inform members of the Legislative Assembly that we have made significant progress toward the establishment of the protected area with the negotiation of a draft establishment agreement between the Government of Northwest Territories and the Lutso K'e Dene First Nation. The Chief and Council for Lutso K'e have authorized a ratification vote for the general membership to take place on February 18, 2019. We are hopeful for a positive outcome of this vote, which will continue to move us towards our goal of having a signed establishment agreement. A completed establishment agreement between the Lutso K'e Dene First Nation and the Government of Northwest Territories is one of the number of agreements required to establish the Tyendinaene. That includes a land transfer agreement with Parks Canada for the transfer of approximately 14,000 square kilometres of land required to establish the National Park Reserve. This session, our government intends to introduce a Protected Areas Act, which will be used to establish Tyendinaene. This legislation will allow us to develop regulations for these protected areas based on the final establishment agreement. Mr. Speaker, I can also advise the Legislative Assembly that we have taken significant strides toward establishing a regional management body for Tyendinaene that will include all Acacio communities, the Northwest Territories Métis Nation, Parks Canada, and the Government of the Northwest Territories. More work still needs to be done to formalize this arrangement and conclude agreements with other Indigenous organizations, but the negotiation of a draft establishment agreement with the Lutso K'e Dene First Nation is a significant milestone in the long journey towards establishing Tyendinaene. I would like to recognize the efforts of everyone involved in helping to advance the finalization of this important initiatives, and I look forward to keeping members apprised of the progress. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Mackenzie Delta.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to point out two significant events happening this weekend in the Mackenzie Delta and the Inuvik region. First, let me mention hockey players. As many as 300 youth ages 4 to 17 will flock to Inuvik both yesterday and today, to participate in the annual Gwich'in Cup. This event is held each March, has 6 divisions, and welcomes all youth. Teams are made up upon registration numbers. Players are put on teams not by community but by age. The weekend hockey competition and skills takes place today, Friday, right through to Sunday. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Inuvik Minor Hockey Association for organizing the event and also the Gutchin Tribal Council for generously supporting financially. Young hockey players from the entire region look forward to this weekend. Good luck to each of the players participating this weekend in the Gutchin Cup. And Mr. Speaker, the other event happening in Fort McPherson is the first annual Trapper Blake Memorial Hockey Tournament. This event is honoring the late Alan Blake Jr., also known as Trapper, who lost his life tragically last February. He was the captain of his hockey team, the LJ Sabres. He took pride in playing competitive hockey and was always encouraging others to get out and play. Teams will gather in Fort McPherson to pay tribute to Trapper, someone who lost his life at such a young age, 22 years young, lived a healthy lifestyle, friends with everyone who crossed his path. 4 hockey teams from the region will compete in the first Trapper Blake Memorial Hockey Tournament. Mr. Speaker, congratulations to the hockey players this weekend. Good luck and have fun. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Member statement. Member Ika Goodin and the member Young Life North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the most important and far-reaching mandate commitments the 18th Assembly agreed on when we started out was the commitment to resolve land rights agreements. When members on this side have raised this commitment with the Premier, we have been told that progress is being made, that he remains confident that these discussions can be resolved in the life of the 18th Assembly. Mr. Speaker, the clock is ticking. The 18th Assembly is in its final months, and to date we have the Premier's confidence, but not much else. Mr. Speaker, the fair resolution of land rights discussions may be the most pressing thing on our list. Our other priorities cannot be advanced until land rights are resolved. Certainty is essential in order to achieve our mandate of economic growth. It's necessary to achieve our goals in health, social justice, and education. It's necessary to support small business, develop renewable energy, and minimize our carbon footprint. All of these crucial priorities depend on the successful and fair resolution of land rights. These questions have a direct impact in my riding of Yellowknife North. How do we determine the distinction between traditional Indigenous land use and unauthorized squatting? How do we reassure born and raised Northerners we are seeking fee simple ownership of their homes? How do we respond to the interests of the the burgeoning tourism industry when lands are frozen? How do we move forward with the Yellowknife Periphery Recreational Land Use Plan? As of today, with just months left in the 18th Assembly, the answer is, we don't know. With certainty on land rights and self-government in place, communities and regions will be able to establish their own priorities, develop their own economies, and employ their own people. Our system of governance must support and empower Indigenous governments with responsibility and authority for self-determination. This will allow communities to flourish and grow on their own terms. Mr. Speaker, it remains my sincere hope that in this Assembly we can take this important step forward and create a lasting legacy of fairness and certainty. Only with that certainty can we move ahead as Northerners together. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Member statement. Member Ika Goodin and the member Young Life Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to applaud the outstanding efforts of the search and rescue technicians of the 435 Transport and Rescue Squadron based in Winnipeg. The efforts these search and rescue technicians, often called SARTECs, made to reach the site of the downed Air Tindy plane last week was heroic. This is what I've pieced together about their actions from news reports. Air Tindy dispatched a charter flight to Wati on the morning of January 30th and lost contact with the 2 pilots just as the sun rose. Soon afterwards, the company called the Joint Rescue Coordination Centre in Trenton, Ontario for help. Staff there dispatched 435 Squadron from Winnipeg, and they arrived in the late afternoon. Mr. Speaker, last Wednesday, as you may recall, was a cold day in Yellowknife with poor visibility and blowing snow. But searchers in the air were able to find what they thought was the crash site just west of Marion Lake. Search and rescue technicians parachuted out of the Hercules aircraft carrying overnight survival kits and medical supplies. It took 6 or 8 hours for the Sartecs to make their way from the landing to the crash site, wading through chest-deep snow. The Hercules provided light so they could see what they were doing. The overnight low in the area was -24, with a wind chill that made it feel like -33. The techs arrived at the site during the night and were able to confirm the downed plane belonged to Air Tindi and that the pilots had died. By midday, with their work done, the Sartecs were picked up and brought back into Yellowknife. It's important to note that the Sartecs worked with support from the crew in the Hercules, the Canadian Rangers from Betchco, and Air Tindi. Mr. Speaker, most of us have experienced flying in small planes to reach distant and remote communities. We depend on companies like Air Tindi to get us there safely, and 99.9% of the time that's what happens. But as Northerners, we know that accidents are a reality. When they happen, we depend on search and rescue technicians, the people who are willing to jump out of a plane on a dark and stormy night to see if they can help. I am grateful to 435 Squadron and our own 440 Squadron for their efforts last week and every time they're called on. Merci.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. On January 23rd, the federal and territorial governments announced funding for the Tolson Hydro Expansion Project. There's $480,000 from Canada to support feasibility and engineering work for the expansion, and $620,000 to support Indigenous engagement. Our government will have to come up with $120,000 for the feasibility and engineering work. It's not clear who will actually receive the money, when, and whether this is old money or new. Hydroelectricity is not necessarily green energy. There are impacts on water quality, aquatic life, release of greenhouse gases, mercury, and to people as well. After 30 years of operation, there's still a public health advisory in place due to mercury contamination of lake trout in Anacho Lake, the headwaters of the Tolson system. The Honourable Member for Tunaday-Welladay has described the adverse impacts from the construction and operation of the Tolson system. Cabinet's current plans for Tolson expansion will concentrate most of our energy efforts into one mega project. This will take away money from small community energy projects where the cost of living is very high already. Getting those communities onto renewables would reduce energy costs for everyone in the Northwest Territories. Large hydro projects have a very poor track record of delivering power on time and at predicted costs. Consider the current Commission of Inquiry respecting the Muskrat Falls project and the huge cost overruns for Site C on the Peace River. Why has there been no serious evaluation of other energy options outside of the Tolson expansion? With no buyers, no funding, and no business plan, Tolson Hydro is not the answer to our energy needs. Existing excess power at Tolson should be used to build the regional economy on the south side of the lake by powering electrical vehicles and heating homes and businesses. There are alternatives to Tolson. Building local and household energy self-sufficiency should be the direction we move in. Much better would be a comprehensive program for heating and transportation, as well as electricity production. Energy efficient retrofits and conversion of all homes and buildings to wood pellet heating would cost less, reduce more greenhouse gas emissions, create more local employment, actually reduce the cost of living and doing business, and improve our housing situation. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member Tunaday-Welladay.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I would like to talk about my concerns regarding the increased list of data information breaches that have occurred within the Department of Health and Social Services over the last 9 years. Since 2010, there has been at least 10 known incidences of significant breaches regarding privacy and personal patient information contained within GNWT's Department of Health and Social Services. The type of breaches vary, but in each case has nevertheless resulted in patient information being compromised in some way. The first two breaches, Mr. Speaker, consist of a series of faxes containing highly personal medical information being sent to incorrect recipients. Breach 3, Mr. Speaker, identified in April 2013 by the Territorial Privacy Commissioner for incorrectly storing patient health records in their data systems. Breach number 4 occurred July 2014 with a total number of 195 healthcare cards mailed to the incorrect mailing address. Mr. Speaker, I can go on to identify each case, but others include one patient psychiatric assessment being ill-advisedly sent to her employer, the doctor losing unencrypted USB drive that had health information from at least 4,000 patients, a discovery that several staffers at the hospital were unfittingly accessing patient health records, irregularities found with referral paperwork at a health authority, an unencrypted laptop that contained health records for more than 33,000 NWT residents was stolen from a car in Ottawa. A man found a banker's box filled with hundreds of confidential patient records. Mr. Speaker, this is a growing list of privacy breaches. This growing list of privacy breaches is extremely concerning. According to this list, at least 38,000 people whose information of privacy was breached in some way. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statements. Member statement, member for Camp Lake.
Mr. Speaker, it is with heartfelt sorrow that I rise today to pay my respects to Michael Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson passed away at the age of 60 after a prolonged battle with cancer. I worked very closely with Mr. Ferguson, or Mike as he was affectionately known, in his role as the Auditor General for the NWT and for Canada. He upheld his responsibilities to the people of the Northwest Territories and all Canadians with integrity, honesty, and passion. His dedication to transparency and accountability in these times where it is harder and harder to know what is really real was and still is a guiding light for me as a public servant. Mike worked tirelessly to ensure that the people whom he served received the best possible services from their governments, all while cutting through the spin to ensure that those governments were meeting the guidelines, milestones, and conditions they publicly set for themselves. On a more personal level, Mike was a warm, kind, compassionate, and down-to-earth man with a wonderful sense of humor. He will be greatly missed by all. My thoughts and condolences are with his family, friends, and loved ones. I will remember him fondly and try my best to honor his memory. Rest in peace, my friend. You, your work, your presence, and laughter will all be sorely missed, but rest assured that you and your contributions to our democracy will never be forgotten. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Our condolences to the family members as well. Member statement. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Zika Tetso was born in Fort Simpson on September 11, 1983, to Alice Dolly Kazon and Edward Lafferty. She was raised and lived her whole life in Fort Simpson. She passed away on January 8, 2019. When people spoke about Ruzika, they remembered spending time together and her stories. They're stories that consistently revealed her absolute bottomlessly love for her sons, Demetrius and Zortan, her parents, brothers, sisters, indeed all her family and friends. Her mother, Dolly, tells stories of her daughter as a mischievous child, always having the maximum amount of fun possible with her friends, and as Ruzika became a young woman, the tender moments they shared when she came home to touch base with her mother. Her family talks about how Ruzika was a rough and tumble girl in her childhood, often playing and keeping up with the boys. This did not come as a surprise for people, and it served her well when she joined the Canadian Rangers in 2005. During her career with the 1st Canadian Ranger Patrol Group, Rosika served in Operation Nanook, Operation Nunupuk, and as many local areas, Type 1 and 2 exercises. In March of 2011, Rosika took top shot for the Fort Simpson Ranger Patrol, the first and only female to accomplish this. During the local exercises, Rosika would put her all into every task assigned to her, and when she would see others begin to tire, she would bring out that smile, the huge smile, the one that would reassure that no matter how hard the task, we were going to have fun accomplishing it. Rosika could turn hard work into play. Rosika always found something to giggle about, and these giggles were infectious. Everybody worked hard, looked forward to uncontrollable and embarrassing belly laughs that followed. Most notably in her Ranger career, Rosika served at Operation Nanook in Fort Resolute Bay, where First Air Flight 6560 crashed. With this happening, Rosika volunteered for the most difficult of tasks. Over the course of 4 days and nights, Rosika did this work with poise and persistence. As a young woman, Rosika showed most maturity during this moment, or this time, and as always, she maintained her ability to lift the team's spirits with her love and laughter. She was survived by her father, Ernest Tetso Sr., mother, 6 brothers, 3 sisters, and 2 sons. The Quezon and Tetso family would like to take this moment to thank the friends, families, and community to our beloved Rosika for their kind words and support during this time.
Again, our condolences to the family and also to the community. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Trinidad-Willowdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize interpreters from Trinidad-Willowdale. I'd like to recognize Tommy Anka, who will be interpreting Trinidad-Willowdale or Chippewa language for the entire sitting, and Rose Sandberg, who will be interpreting in the Tlinshaw and Willowdale language. Thank you.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize and welcome resident of Yellowknife North and president of Local 11, Frank Walsh. Thank you for being here.
Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Inuvik Boot Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize one of our translators that's been here all week, Ms. Lillian Elias, who's been a very strong advocate for Indigenous languages as well as culture in the Inuvik and throughout the Northwest Territories. And once again, I'd like to welcome and recognize 2 pages of mine, Corbin and Ava Grace Dempster, and thank you for all the hard work that you guys have done for us members in the Legislative Assembly this week. Masi.
Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. If we're missing anyone in gallery, thanks for being here witnessing our proceedings. It's always great to have an audience. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in a CBC News article, NWT in talks to raise debt limit as budget projects slight deficit, published on February 6th of this year, the finance minister has indicated that he's reached out to his federal counterpart and begin discussions on raising the debt limit. Can the minister offer more details on what is happening in these discussions? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I have had initial discussions with Minister Morneau on our debt limit, and we haven't gone very deep into the discussion yet. I did indicate to him that it is our desire to sit with himself and his officials and start the discussion of actually raising our debt limit, and he was receptive to that. So we're just looking at a time where we can actually sit down and have that conversation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Cassie, member Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I think I'm hearing it's fair to characterize this as early stages of discussions. When is the minister going to involve this side of the House in those discussions? It'd be nice to know what's driving this, what our fiscal needs are, and what he's asking his federal counterpart for. Can the minister let us know when we're going to be involved in those discussions? Thank you.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, through a number of the briefings we've had with committees on our financial situation and the desire if we were to take on larger projects, while challenge we'd be faced with our current debt limit, given that an initial, but I do commit to members something as important as this. Obviously, I will be keeping members up to date, and if there's a desire from, if there's a desire from the members to have the minister sit with them before I go and have my discussions with the federal finance minister and seek their input and advice, I'd be glad to do that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadadea, Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for that commitment. It's very much appreciated. I wonder if these talks are going to dovetail with the territorial financing formula discussions that are upcoming. Can the Minister provide any clarity on that? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, any opportunity we have to raise the discussion on the territorial formula financing with our federal counterpart is one we take advantage of. And if there's an opportunity during our discussions to do that, this will have no, the debt limit will have no effect on the territorial formula financing. That's kind of a separate discussion. But we use every opportunity in our discussions with Ottawa to raise our need for further funding for the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question, Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate that these are separate topics, but they are somewhat intrinsically linked. You either have money to spend or money to spend through borrowing. And if we're not getting it from TFF, then we're going to have to raise taxes. And obviously, 45,000 people can't exactly bear that burden or provide the government with the resources it needs to take on these projects. So is the minister willing to bring TFF into this conversation? I'm fine with either approach, but we need a strategy to get these projects done. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and any opportunity we have to bring more money into the Northwest Territories without having to go on the backs of our hardworking employees of all sectors of the Northwest Territories and raise taxes. I think we've done a good job in the last 3 years, and I've made it quite clear from day one that we've not raised personal income tax in the Northwest Territories because we do know that our residents are challenged as it is with the high cost of living, especially in a lot of the smaller communities, and so we don't want to add further burden. But if we're able to have that discussion with Ottawa and talk about an increase to our TFF, so we're able to have the money to still deliver a lot of the programs and job creating opportunities we have, then we'll take advantage of it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My questions are for the Minister of Infrastructure. The Minister, along with his federal counterpart, recently announced $1.2 million for expansion of Tolson Hydro. This House approved a capital budget for 2019-20 in the fall. Can the Minister explain whether the funding announced recently is actually new money or what is already in the capital budget for 2019-20? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'm going to read my notes because this stuff is from all different sources. The funding is coming from 2 federal sources with some additional funding from the GNWT. From Canor, we're receiving $480K with an additional $120K from the Government of Northwest Territories funding. This is an allocation for technical and commercial work on the project. From CERNAC, we're receiving $619,950,000. This money will be used to support Indigenous partnership. Funding for technical questions is only sufficient to take us to the end of this fiscal year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nakita Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Minister for that, and I'll double check to see where the $120,000 is coming from, whether it's the capital or the O&M budget. But as far as I know, there are no buyers for Tolson expansion power, no secured funding other than this little drop in the bucket, and no business case. Can the minister explain whether there is a business case for Tolson expansion, or when that might be ready, and whether it will be shared with the public and this side of the House? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, the funding, the GNWT sources from the existing O&M budget, just to answer the member's question. This project is premised on the fact that the federal support is required for the project, and that it will become a driver for clean growth for the people of the Northwest Territories. A preliminary business case will be prepared for this fiscal year. Work is still underway to find a high-level cost for the transmission component. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadadea Cassie, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the minister for doing his homework there on his feed. The last estimate that I'm aware of for the full expansion of Tolson seems to be well over $1 billion. Does the minister actually have any preliminary cost estimates for this mega project, and can he share that information with this side of the House now? Merci, Mr. Speaker. Full expansion, please. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we've done a number of technical work and stuff that was done previously in the previous assemblies on this work, that stuff is going to be part of the updated stuff that we will have to work on. The transmission system is still under study, so it would be premature to speculate what that new cost would be, because it's a whole different type of system. As I've said before in this House, we're looking at the first underwater high current direct or high voltage direct current line under the Great Slave Lake. We're waiting for those costs to still come back, but once we compile these types of costs, I'd be glad to share with committee. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundida Cassie, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the minister for that, and I hope that he can make the figure actually public. But in the minister's statement yesterday, he claims that the full expansion or some kind of expansion of Tolson Hydro is going to remove up to 240,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Yet in the 2030 energy strategy, the claim is 227,000 kilotons of greenhouse gas emissions. So maybe hopes are growing that Tolson's going to continue to grow. But what is going on with these greenhouse gas reduction figures? And can the minister explain the discrepancy? Which one is the right figure? And can he provide some calculations behind that? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For those of you that have read the energy strategy very, very closely, in there it clearly states the Northwest Territories needs to reduce our GHGs by 517 kilotons by 2030 to meet our targets for the 2030 Pan-Canadian framework that we've signed on to. Of this, 290 kilotons can be achieved through a variety of models, reducing diesel generation in communities, industrial efficiency, renewable heating in communities, transportation, etc. So that leaves us a gap of 227 kilotons, which is in there. The 240 from the Tolson project, which it would generate, would be sufficient to meet this gap. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Hikada Cannon, the member Yonge-Life Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Finance. In a communique issued to the unionized workforce in July of last year, he said, and I quote, "You would not be able to return to work during a strike to perform other unionized work." My question for the Minister is, why did this position change? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the member could explain a little further, I'm not sure what's changed. Communique going out that if folks wanted to, if they wanted to return to work, then they would not be asked to do other tasks that's not within their own personal job description. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nakeda Cassie, member Yonge-Life Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Let's fast forward now to Tuesday when the Minister said in this House, and I quote, "I think that this is one of these situations where we show due respect on both sides of the table, and we would hope that would bring the temperature down." End quote. So imagine my surprise when I saw the government waiver that was handed out to unionized workers yesterday. How does that action square with his statement earlier in the week of bringing the temperature down? Merci.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, obviously we would like to see things cool down a bit. However, providing information to employees, somebody's got to provide employees with information. So we've provided them with the information upon a lot of employees' requests about the waiver, and if you read the one from last week, we've encouraged them to speak to their union representatives, and this waiver is part of that process. So I don't think it's inflaming anything. It doesn't really matter what we say. At the temperature things are at, nothing's going to calm it down anyway. So this is just providing information, Mr. Speaker, and somebody needs to keep the members of the public services informed. Thank you.
Masi. Oral question, Tada de Cassie member Young Life Center.
Masi, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to provide the Minister of Finance with some information. It is further inflaming the situation. I don't understand what the government is thinking they're going to accomplish by handing out these forms, except to make everybody more mad. And there is a sort of an impugning of intention here that the government is, that the picket line is going to be aggressive, and that there needs to be some kind of indemnification for the government. So does the minister not see that in fact this is fanning the flames? And why would he want to do that? Thank you.
Masi. Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Minister is not fanning the flames. We're providing information. People want information. They need to know, to have the information to make an informed decision, and they know the consequence of the decision they're going to make. We need to give them that opportunity, and this is just part of the process of as we prepare for what we're hoping is not going to happen. And we will do our darndest as we're going into mediation. I told committee that the other night, to reach an agreement. We've all seen the emails from a lot of people out there that are concerned. There's some emails saying, well, that's going to decide where I go on October 1st. That's fine. That's part of the process every 4 years. We hear that. But I'm hearing from people that are wanting to know, how am I going to pay my mortgage? How am I going to look after my 3 children? We're going to use that as a backdrop as we go into negotiations to try to find a deal that works for them, for us, for the union, and especially for the people in the Northwest Territory. That's what we should be thinking about. I don't believe we're fanning any flames. We're providing people with information. Members always want information. They stand up, ask me a question, can you provide more information? I say yes. Same situation. We're providing information. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nudede Cassie member Young Life Center.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Not surprisingly, the Minister and I have a difference of opinion here about providing information that undermines the union's position in ways that are completely unnecessary. They have the right to strike, and the norm is for unionized people to, they don't have to be on the picket line, but they are not usually welcomed back with open arms for crossing the picket line. I stand by my position that I think that this inflames an already very volatile situation, and I would like to know what the purpose is of handing out these waiver forms. What is the purpose? Thank you.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, absolutely, the union has a right to strike, and they've served a strike notice, and we respect their position. Doesn't mean we have to agree with it, but we respect it. But people out there also have a right to go to work, and they have a right to have the proper information to help them make an informed decision. That's all we ask of each other. We want to have the right information to make an informed decision. We're giving them that opportunity. Unfortunately, it might be perceived differently by some, but we have to give people the right to choose. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Hikada Academy, the member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, recently, well, actually probably ever since I've been elected, I've had a number of constituents come to me and ask questions about medical travel, and I've been trying to get the information out there as best as I can. Sometimes I may not be doing it properly, but I will have some questions for the Minister of Health and Social Services. The first question I have is, there seems to be some difference, there's different forms of medical travel. Can the Minister please explain how GNWT staff have a different per diem rate than non-insured residents. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, medical travel is not an insured services under the NWT Healthcare Plan. The GNWT provides medical travel benefits through medical travel policy to eligible residents if they have no other sources of benefits in an effort to ensure that transportation expenses are not an economic barrier to accessing insured health services. However, the medical travel policy is only one of many policies and insurance plans that provide medical travel benefits to residents throughout the Northwest Territories. When patients are eligible for benefits through an employer, or a third party, those benefits must take precedence over the GNWT's medical travel plans. With respect to the GNWT employees have a negotiated benefit called medical travel that provides terms and conditions that determine how much individuals get while they travel on medical travel. They're not covered by GNWT medical travel. They're covered by an employee benefit. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Cassie, member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I greatly appreciate the Minister's answer, and it helps clear up a little bit more as we move forward. I've noticed, though, that the federal government medical travel differs from the GNWT medical travel. Is there a reason that ours is different than that? And if there is, can the Minister explain why the differences are? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I indicated, medical travel is not an insured service under the NWT's healthcare plan, and it is if an employer has a benefit, those benefits will take precedence. So the federal government does have a benefit program around medical travel. Theirs will take priority over the GNWT plan. Many of our residents have access to medical travel benefits through their employer, whether it's the federal government or the GNWT, private businesses. And employer benefits generally surpass the benefits offered under the medical travel policy and are subject to different decision-making criteria, which are dictated by the employer and the plan that's in front of them, usually through the collective agreement or policy documents or purchased through third-party providers. So those employers having a program, the employees are to use those programs. If the employer doesn't have a program, then they can come to the GNWT program.
Oral question, Cassie, member Nehende.
And thank you to the Minister for his answer. It's my understanding through the federal employees and their families, they have to pay for their costs for the hotels, their per diem up front for medical travel. And is there a possibility that the government can cover these costs and get reimbursed to journal vouchers from the federal government instead of having the families foot these costs? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, many employers, such as the federal government, authorize and coordinate travel from within their organization for their employees or their dependents to ensure that their benefits are applied as intended. In such cases, the Territorial Authority Medical Travel Office does not have any involvement in their travel, does not process any of their authorizations, or have knowledge of their travel plans. It is possible that a person may receive employer travel benefits, but not actually qualify for coverage under our own medical travel policy. However, the NWT Health and Social Services Authority's Medical Travel Office does not have the authority to interpret collective agreements or administer benefits on behalf of an employer or other third-party insurers. Some employees, and I know some employers actually provide the opportunity to provide travel advances. We don't dictate, we don't control, we don't even approve medical travel for some of these third-party providers, so we would not be in a position to fund in advance because we have a completely different program. So short answer on this one, Mr. Speaker, is no, we don't.
Massey. Oral question, Cassie, member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would hope that we could be able to do something, but I understand we're dealing with different policy or benefits there. Previously in this House, the Minister has talked about medical travel policy being reviewed. And so can the minister please advise what the status of this medical travel policy review is, the status of it right now? Thank you, Mr.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I met with committee last October to provide a bit of an update on the medical travel policy review and to get feedback and advice from the committee members to help inform the final changes that need to be made. Feedback from committee was received in November. Thank you very much for getting that to us. And we're working to revise the policies, has already started. These policy revisions will be completed this spring in 2019 with the intent to implement the changes during the remaining months of this term. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Ikeda Canon, the member Tuna de Willade.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, in my member statement, I talk about the breaches that we've been hearing about now and then with the health and social services system. I'd like to ask the minister what's being done to put safeguards in place to prevent future breaches. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the honourable member from Tuna de Willade and I came into this assembly at the same time in October 27, 2007. And in 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, and 2012, we received reports from the Privacy Commissioner that said this government badly needs a Health Information Act. In 2013, when the member was the Honourable Health Minister, he moved and did first and second reading of the Health Information Act, which was passed in 2014 when I was the minister. This act is a huge step in the right direction. Prior to this act, the only time health information breaches became public is when things happened to be faxed to media, and they did not escalate to the same degree that they did. Since the Health Information Act has come in, we have an obligation and responsibility to train staff to provide indication to our residents when there are breaches, to notify those affected. We have been able to learn from each of the breaches that has occurred. We are continuing to make improvements. In 2015, when the Act went live, we came with a health informationer's guide, a health information guide guidance manual. Based on what we've heard and what we've learned from these breaches, we're doing a major upgrade to that privacy manual, the compliance manual. We're continuing to train staff. And we will continue to do so. I understand one of the committees recently had a meeting with the Privacy Commissioner on her report. I'm looking forward to any more recommendations that come out of that so that we can continue to work together to strengthen our response to privacy breaches and make sure that our public is informed and breaches are not occurring. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the Kidade Cassie member Tuna de Willade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the health and social services system is huge, as we all know. Probably there are hundreds of employees, maybe 1,600 employees. I'd like to ask the minister if there's designated employees only that handle confidential health records. Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are specific individuals that have been targeted and highlighted as the information, and I'm blanking on the title of the position. I really apologize. I can't remember the name. But they're designated as specific individuals responsible for information. But at the same time, we're also training all of our staff on the rights and responsibilities under privacy. So everybody in the department's been trained. In the Territorial Authority, we got about 70% trained. In Hay River, I think we're at about 40%. Tlicho, we're not quite there. I think we only got about 30% trained. But we're working to train everybody, regardless of the fact that we have some individuals dedicated with some additional responsibilities to ensure that privacy is maintained and understood when breaches occur. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadade Cassie member Tuna de Willade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, by no means would I ever assume that any employee would breach confidentiality deliberately. I'd like to ask the minister, is there a follow-up with employees when there are breaches to this health information? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, when there is a privacy breach, every privacy breach to date has been actually significantly different. than the one before, except for maybe the faxes that were sent prior to the legislation existing, and which is actually one of the main reasons that we moved forward with legislation. I'm sure the member remembers. So when an incident occurs, it's investigated. If there is employee responsibility, if progressive discipline would be applied appropriately, additional training might be provided. Every situation is different, Mr. Speaker. We can't paint every one of them with the same brush, but where appropriate, progressive discipline may apply. Thank you.
Masi. Oral question. Nudere Kasi, member Tunade Walade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister a question on the breaches. When it's a hard copy of a thing like the box of files, it's easy to say we've recovered them all. Is the Minister confident that information that could be digital or transmitted in various ways have all been recovered? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not 100% sure what the member is asking. If the member is asking whether or not we've been able to obtain all the files on the Simpson case, we believe we have all the files. When it comes to the USB that was lost, the USB was found. When it comes to the laptop that was stolen, it's our understanding that it wasn't encrypted, which was the problem, but we also based on the fact that the computer never connected to the network, we're not sure, we don't believe that information actually was ever public. It doesn't change our obligation or responsibility to notify our residents when there has been a breach. The laptop was never found, the memory stick was found. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question. I'm not sure I fully understood what the member was asking. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Earlier in my questions with the Minister of Infrastructure, he talked about the 240 kiloton reductions in greenhouse gas emissions claimed in yesterday's statement about Tulsan. Can the Minister provide those calculations publicly and table them in the House before the end of this sitting? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, we can do that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Nakita Dayakasi, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks very much to the Minister for that commitment. So I know that Alberta just went on the market to get some additional power. They spent $1 billion to get 600 megawatts of wind energy at 3.7 cents per kilowatt hour. We're paying over 24 cents a kilowatt hour here in Yellowknife. So I'm trying to figure out the Minister's rationale for saying that Alberta and Saskatchewan are actually going to want to buy our power. We should be actually bringing it up from Alberta. But so can the Minister provide some rationale for why he thinks that Alberta and Saskatchewan will actually want to buy our power? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When you start looking at the whole electrical grid system across North America, which is not connected at this point, actually, and the federal government is having a serious look at how they can do that to help make a more stable grid right across the country and share renewables. But the situation with Alberta and Saskatchewan, the member doesn't bring up, is they're on an extensive amount of coal. Both of these provinces have coal generation that they need to get off there to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Saskatchewan is clearly, well, actually both provinces are clearly at the odds right now with the federal government around the climate change strategy. We're committed to fulfilling our obligation, and this is one of the prospects that we need to look at to expand our hydro facility to benefit from it in the most potential way we can. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Dayakasi, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Minister for that. I just to be clear, that power in Alberta is wind power. We're not talking about coal generated. We're talking wind. But I do want to ask the Minister, the Indigenous governments that he seems to indicate are on board for Tolston expansion. Does that include Denino Coin First Nation? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned in my statement yesterday with one of the questions that I answered, I've had discussions with the Akecho, which does include Denny Nukwe, at the table at that time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question. Nundida Cassie, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Minister for that. So, has the Minister actually spoken to anybody from the Denino First Nation about Tolson recently? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I stated, I said I met with the Akecho, and Denny Nukwe was there represented by their leadership, and I had a conversation with all leaders of the Akecho First Nations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral questions. Oral questions. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to budget address, day 3 of 7. Replies to budget address, day 3 of 7. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of committee on the review of bills. Tabling of documents. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pursuant to Section 13, bracket 1 of the Natural Resources Conservation Trust Act, I wish to table the following document entitled The Natural Resources Conservation Trust Fund Financial Statements for the year ended March 31st, 2018. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Tabling of documents. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to table the following document: Employee Acknowledgement and Waiver Crossing Picket Line. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Motions. Member for Young Life Center.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Whereas the Government of the Northwest Territories and the Union of Northern Workers have been negotiating a collective agreement for the last 3 years, and whereas the Union of Northern Workers and the Government of the Northwest Territories have agreed to mediation scheduled to take place on February 8th and February 9th, 2019, in an attempt to reach a collective agreement, and whereas the Union of Northern Workers has served the Government of the Northwest Territories with strike notice for 12:01 a.m. on February the 11th, 2019, in the event that mediation fails, and whereas the Union of Northern Workers has agreed to enter into binding arbitration to produce a new collective agreement, now therefore I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Cam Lake, that this Assembly call on the Government of the Northwest Territories to agree to enter into binding arbitration before the scheduled strike begins. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motions in order. To the motion. Member for Young Life Center.
Yeah. Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm proposing this motion because I believe that entering into binding arbitration is preferable to a strike. If both parties agree to arbitration, then the strike action will be cancelled. Arbitration acknowledges that collective bargaining has failed, and it provides a path forward to resolve this dispute in a way that is fair to both sides. It allows for the government and the union to save face without the parties calling one another winners or losers. Mr. Speaker, I have the greatest respect for collective bargaining. My father was a proud member of the trade union for most of his work life. I wrote my master's thesis in Western Canadian labour history about the appalling working conditions that resulted in hundreds of miners dying in the Crow's Nest Pass. I was a member of a union during my 16 years at CBC. In that time, strikes happened on what felt like a regular schedule. When I think about those events at the CBC, I think about the tension of having to cross the picket line because my union wasn't on strike. I remember a riot at the Broadcast Centre in Toronto at the end of one of those strikes, where there was a brawl in the atrium and police outside on horseback. It was ugly. Mr. Speaker, Yellowknife has its own tragic experience with strikes. I'm of course talking about the labour dispute at the Giant Mine. I didn't live here then, but what happened in Yellowknife was news everywhere. Labour action polarized the community. People threw punches, ended friendships, and moved away. I got to witness the fallout while I was a reporter covering the civil trial in 2003-2004. Widows and mothers talked about their lost husbands and sons, their lives broken and unable to mend without them. At the trial, union members watched video of the mayhem on the picket line and said they didn't recognize themselves as those angry, volatile people of 10 years earlier. They told the judge they said and did things in the heat of the moment that they still regretted. My point is that strikes can be dangerous because stakes are high, tempers flare, and the results are unpredictable. We've already seen the tension rising. The union served legal strike notice. Government put out an email to staff highlighting the possibility of crossing the picket line. The union confronted the Premier at his constituency meeting, and most recently, the government has distributed a waiver for people to sign who want to cross the picket line. It's easy to see how confrontation on the picket line is not just likely, it is inevitable. Mr. Speaker, I've had dozens of emails and messages supporting the union's request for binding arbitration. One woman is a single mom, a relief worker with 2 part-time jobs. She is struggling to keep up with her bills. She is asking for an end to casual positions so that she has job security. Another woman has talked about the need to end the widespread use of casuals and term positions in order to build up a permanent northern workforce. I am touched that people have shared their personal circumstances with me and their belief that all of us can help them by supporting this motion. I believe that of all the communities, Yellowknife has the most to lose if there is a strike. We have the biggest number of workers who are eligible to strike, and we have the largest retail sector. A strike is bad news in every way. At a minimum, it will divide the community and put families on the financial ropes. I have also heard from people who are not members of the union, but who are worried about their small businesses, specifically that a strike will dry up consumer spending and result in them laying off staff or even closing shop. Mr. Speaker, there is no upside to a strike, none at all. Mr. Speaker, I want to make a couple of points that may be obvious to us as MLAs, but may not be clear to the public. The first is that this motion is legal, and what it is requesting is legal. The Public Service Act doesn't say anything about arbitration in these circumstances, but that doesn't mean it can't happen. The union did not give up the ability to participate in arbitration when they acquired the right to strike. The two are not mutually exclusive. The starting point for arbitration is to have the GNWT and the Union of Northern Workers agree between themselves to enter binding arbitration, and they can do this at any point. In fact, they could decide to do it today as a backstop to the possibility that mediation doesn't produce an agreement this weekend. The rules of arbitration would be set by the parties themselves, and they would agree on the choice of the arbitrator. As I said earlier, once the parties agree to arbitration, the strike action is cancelled. And to clear up any confusion around the issue of whether the union has formally requested arbitration, the President of the Union wrote a letter to the Minister of Finance this week requesting the government agree to enter binding arbitration. We are waiting for the Minister to respond. Mr. Speaker, these negotiations have gone on for far too long. Negotiations began in January of 2016, and while the two sides met frequently through that year and in 2017, there's only one negotiation session last year. It's hard to say what mediation produced in the fall, except an agreement to meet again this weekend. I haven't given up hope that an agreement is still possible. I encourage both parties to put aside the escalating tensions of this week and work hard to get an agreement through mediation. It's the last opportunity to negotiate an agreement that both parties have a say in. If that fails, binding arbitration moves everything to a third party, and he or she will decide on the concessions. There are no guarantees that either side will get what they want, but this process is preferable to a strike. Mr. Speaker, I am aware that this motion is not binding on the government, even if all 11 regular MLAs vote for it. But it's important for us to provide advice to this government. We have the right as MLAs to speak on any topic in this House, especially on one of the biggest issues of our Assembly. We are not interfering. We are doing our jobs. I truly believe that a strike would be a disaster for Yellowknife, for our families and friends, for our communities and our territory. And that's what I've heard from constituents throughout the last few days. Colleagues, I urge each and every one of you to support this motion and bring the possibility of a strike to an end before it starts. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. To the motion, member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to stand in support of this motion that calls for binding arbitration as the clear resolution to the collective bargaining dispute between the government and the Union of Northern Workers, and leave us with a 100% chance of a no-strike situation. This motion should be uncontroversial. The honourable members of this House have risen many times to call for a fair deal that respects both sides of the dispute and results in a new collective agreement between the government and its workers. This motion will achieve that result, a result that has not been possible under the current conditions of the bargaining process. It is imperative that members carefully consider what is at stake, and I ask that they too stand in support of this motion. Mr. Speaker, after 3 long years of prolonged negotiations, Northerners are frustrated and worried. The uncertainty created by the lack of a collective agreement, all the while the cost of living continues to rise, has further intensified the concern many express for the future of our territory. As leaders of the Northwest Territories, we must do whatever we can to provide confidence in the ability of the government to manage its affairs and prevent any damage to our all too fragile economy. I have accepted my responsibility in this matter. As the representative of Cam Lake, I did not speak up or speak out for a very long time. I naively assumed that the difference between both sides of the bargaining table could be overcome through mediation and that they be carried out in a professional and good faith manner. When the union gave its strike notice earlier this week, it raised the seriousness of this matter to a new level and has left me unconvinced that the next round of mediation will succeed without the intervention of political leaders. Northerners will feel far worse than frustration if picket lines form outside their workplaces and public buildings. There will be anger, division, cost to local businesses, further insecurity, and most of all, lost wages and time spent supporting important government initiatives that this Assembly has committed to accomplish in the time remaining before the election. I cannot fathom any of my honourable colleagues wishing for that outcome. So I ask all of us in this chamber to support the only course of action that will ensure there can be no strike and still achieve a fair deal, binding arbitration as is called for in this motion. I expect that the Honourable Premier and many Cabinet Ministers will ask us here today to believe in the process and allow mediation to go ahead without new political direction from this House. Mr. Speaker, this process has led to the imminent threat of strike and pushed the parties farther apart in recent months. I cannot and will not continue to support what can only be seen as a clearly broken process that has spiraled out of control. The Legislative Assembly has within its power and jurisdiction to change broken processes, to update legislation, and should do all it can to avoid a strike through binding arbitration. In supporting this motion, I acknowledge the concerns that have been raised in the media and our citizens that binding arbitration is undefined in the current version of the Public Service Act. This confusion has been heightened by recent reporting on the history of the Act, wherein binding arbitration was replaced in 1996 with strike action as the final resolution mechanism available to a labour dispute. I want to set the record straight and be very clear in my understanding of the Act. Although there is a process identified in the Public Service Act that ends in strike action, there is no restriction on the ability of negotiators to pursue different dispute resolution mechanisms. The Act is completely silent on binding arbitration, and most importantly, does not explicitly prohibit its use. Therefore, it is a completely acceptable and reasonable tool available to end this dispute, and, I argue, far more preferable to a divisive strike that will harm our communities, relationships, and our economy. Again, if the process isn't working, I see no reason why we would force anyone to continue down a path that inevitably will lead to disastrous consequences when other options can legally be made available. The lack of clarity within the Public Service Act on binding arbitration is just one of many examples of why we, as lawmakers, must take a careful look at this law and propose amendments to improve its use, provide better understanding of available tools, and modernize many features of the outdated legislation. These changes are not, however, required to support the successful outcome of this motion, but are important for future rounds of collective bargaining and to ensure that Northern workers have world-class legislation supporting their labour rights. With a better understanding of the nature of binding arbitration in the context of the Public Service Act, this motion must then be understood as a question of leadership and not a question of law. The honourable members of this House are the elected leaders and representatives of the people here in the Northwest Territories. If they can pass laws and legislation, they can weigh in on decisions within their power and jurisdiction, including the collective bargaining process, and express their views on a dispute resolution that is different than what is contained within the Act. The only thing preventing this alternative solution from being made a reality is the political will of this Assembly. It's our job to write and maintain the rules and legislation, not find excuses to avoid action and discussion. Now the decision rests in the hands of all of us, and I am calling on my colleagues to support this decision and end the uncertainty and fear that has gripped our communities. I respect all the views of my constituents, but the vast majority have informed me they do not want to strike. The only way I can ensure that outcome and properly serve the people of Cam Lake is to support this motion and vote in favour of binding arbitration. If this motion passes, it guarantees a 100% chance that there will be no strike, and both sides will craft a compromise that results in a new collective agreement. This is what the majority of our people want, and I will not compromise on my support for binding arbitration and a swift end to this already drawn-out labour dispute. Mr. Speaker, this motion is not about taking a side with the union or with the government. In actuality, the Union of Northern Workers gave me a failing grade as a candidate in the 2015 election. I support many of the government's infrastructure priorities and spending decisions, but I cannot support a process that is failing the union, failing the government, and failing our people. Put simply, the process must be changed to ensure the best possible outcome for the Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, sticking with the status quo and continuing to just pass the buck is easy. Taking decisive action is much harder. I ask the honourable members of this House to live up to the expectations of Northerners to put an end to the threat of strike and get a fair deal now. I will stand in support of this motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. To the motion, member for Yellowknife North.
Mr. Speaker, I was a member of the local Steelworkers 182 as an employee of Con Mine when the giant mine strike took place. I assure you, I do not need to be reminded of the impacts of a strike. I lived it. Mr. Speaker, clearly no one in this House wants a strike to take place for so many obvious reasons. Countless constituents and members of the public from all over the territory have shared their deepest concerns with me about fears of a strike. We all know that any reduction or stoppage in critical government services and programs would be detrimental to all Northwest Territories residents. So I understand the intention of this motion, which I know is to offer a path to resolve a contract dispute without favour to either the GNWT or the Union of Northern Workers. And for that, I commend the mover and the seconder of the motion. Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear to all who are following today's proceedings about what today's motion is procedurally and what this motion can or cannot do. It's a recommendation only. Many of my constituents, GNWT employees, business owners, and the public at large have written, called, or messaged me, encouraged me to support this motion today, thinking, believing, or understanding that MLAs have the power by third-party intervention to legally direct the GNWT to accept binding arbitration as a means to resolve this dispute. That is not the case at all. Today's proceedings are not a magic wand or a silver bullet. Only the union and the government can agree to use arbitration and set the terms to be used for the arbitration process, period. I want to repeat this. Today's proceedings, regardless of outcome on the vote, will have no legal bearing or binding on either party involved in the collective bargaining process, as has been the case all along. And only the two parties can agree to use arbitration as a new process to continue toward reaching a tentative agreement. With that said, my concern is the effect of a recommendation for binding arbitration at this time, during what appears to be the last days of mediation toward a collective agreement. At this crucial time, both parties must concentrate on reaching a tentative agreement and not be hindered or impeded by political influence. Mr. Speaker, what I hear from my constituents and see in the news daily causes me great concern. The government and the union do not seem to be concentrating on the job at hand, which is to get a tentative agreement during mediation this weekend. Frankly, I am shocked by some of the conduct I have seen so far. Responsibility is what members expect from both parties going into the ongoing mediation. It is a time for bargaining, not bluster, not threats, not provocation. It's a time for common reason to prevail. Mr. Speaker, anything less is an abrogation of their duties to all the people of the Northwest Territories. I wish to remind the government and the union that they agreed to this mediation process and chose one of Canada's best mediators to conduct its proceedings. Their duty is to bargain honestly and in good faith, and I have no doubt that Mr. Reddy will remind them of this should they stray from the path. There have been too many grave distractions from the path in recent days. I am concerned that dangling the hope of binding arbitration in the middle of mediation is another distraction that will not help produce a tentative agreement this weekend. Collective bargaining is a sensitive matter with its own set of rules and protocols, foreign to most of us outside the profession. These have evolved over many years from experience to maximize the chances for good results. It worries me when pressure is so high to have a new process when mediation is still underway. The mediator has not declared an impasse or made recommendations. As I submitted previously, Mr. Reddy and the respective bargaining teams must not be influenced by a newly recommended process from this House. Mr. Speaker, in the interest of getting the most effective mediation possible, I am not willing to support a new process at this time. Again, I want to be clear. This is not to say that I oppose arbitration as a potential tool to reach a collective agreement. Definitely not. I would support arbitration if the point is reached when it is needed, and I sincerely hope that tool will not be lost to us if needed. Moreover, I would hope that the government and the union would both be interested in a new process if the current one does not yield results. But the bottom line, Mr. Speaker, no matter the chosen process, negotiation, mediation, or arbitration, the process does not do the bargaining. The process is intended to enable a spirit of compromise, but cannot force it on unwilling negotiators. If these bargaining teams live up to their titles as negotiators, we should see a tentative agreement emerge. Mr. Speaker, no doubt they are under tremendous pressure with a heavy burden of responsibility, and I know as they meet this weekend that both sides are very much aware of what's at stake for all residents of the Northwest Territories, and that no additional outside influence is required. Mr. Speaker, I remain confident that under the current agreed-upon process, and by using any and all means available within it, that a tentative collective agreement can and will be reached. Those are my comments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Colleagues, at this point in time, I'm calling for a short break. Massey. Okay, colleagues, we left off on a debate of the motion. Next on my list, member for South 2.
Good afternoon, colleagues. To the motion. We make status quo decisions every day in our homes, in our communities, community and regional leadership's roles, and in this legislative assembly in what we can only deem hopeful would be in the best interest for those whom we serve. Collectively, we possess the opportunity in researching, gathering, and seeking advice on the information that would assist during our decision-making process. Concluding our decision is not an easy one to make and not acceptable by some. However, we have shown leadership by deciding what we stand and what we believe would be in the best interest that placed their trust, the general public, in our abilities on November the 23rd, 2015. Mr. Speaker, no one wants a strike. The Public Services Act describes the process for achieving a collective agreement. We are currently in the mediation stage. The request for binding arbitration is problematic for a number of reasons. First, the Public Service Act does not include provisions for binding arbitration to settle negotiations. Then there's needed through agreed principles guiding the arbitration process. In our deliberation leading on today's decision, this information I share is very important for the public to know. A motion of the Assembly cannot compel the government of the Northwest Territories to take a particular action. That is, a motion adopted by the Legislative Assembly is not binding on the GNWT. A motion that is defeated in the Assembly has no effect and cannot be introduced again during the same session. Our NWT economy is combined by public, industry, and private sectors. All are complementary in generating revenues and opportunities. With the government's prudent and management capacity through the Fiscal Responsibility Policy and the Financial Administration Act, through a fiscally responsible manner, we can see adjustments for capital growth and workforce acknowledgements while realizing positive measures. Unexpected disruptions or forced growth must be considered a gap, and more importantly, where is the loss in covering this gap? These are elements and principles during strategic planning. Capital planning, for example, on schools, health centers, housing, are important parts of the NWT economy and the ability to deliver services to our NWT residents. I can only hope our collective bargaining representatives are negotiating with honesty, integrity, and with the utmost passion and understanding to the challenges faced every day by the majority small communities that make up this territory and the citizens of the Northwest Territories. I must respect the process, show leadership by developing conclusion to a decision. Through research, I'm confident in my abilities not to support this motion, and I have full confidence in both the collective bargaining parties with their knowledge and wisdom in arriving to an equitable agreement this weekend. In closing, I want to say to our colleagues in the House and the listeners, I too have received many emails, and they were very, I would say, very sympathetic to the process and very convincing on the challenges that they face constantly, giving examples what may happen during a strike to their incomes, to their constant day-to-day challenges of payments. And I hope that I have concluded faithfully with the decision today, despite the fact that members of my riding gave me options. I chose an option, and I hope it's in the best interest of everybody in the Northwest Territories. For all these reasons and my reviews, I can't support this motion. Must see, Mr. Chair.
Massey. To the motion, member for Trinity Willowday.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a very difficult motion. It has, as far as I'm concerned, has its positive sides and it has its negative sides. I can say that if this motion was contemplated after a strike, I would support it 100%. Because I am 100% opposed to a strike. And I told that to the media. I spoke to the media. The media reached out to me and asked me the questions. What is your opinion on that? I said a strike is probably the most awful thing that can happen to our communities. The few people in our communities that have good jobs will no longer be employed. Or they will be employed, I guess, at some point in the future, but it's going to have quite a disruption. If this motion does not pass today, or even if this motion passes today, Cabinet can take that as advice from the House and continue on with the mediation. If this motion was put on the floor when there's a strike, I would suggest that everyone in this House would support a motion to go to our binding arbitration, because that would mean that mediation has failed. We've sat in the House here, we sat in committee, and we've asked the government to negotiate in good faith with the union. That's what we've done. We've asked them to go to the table. Go to the table and negotiate in good faith. As they start their discussions, their mediation at the table, Mr. Speaker, we then want to put in a tool that makes that unnecessary. Binding arbitration would make mediation unnecessary. If we have binding arbitration in our back pocket, why would we continue to mediate? We've hired mediators, good mediators. I don't know the guy, but everybody that knows him tells me he's an excellent mediator. We're not going to give him that opportunity with this motion. Why should he continue? Why should anyone listen to him? Right? Let's give him the full opportunity. I'm sure we're paying him good money to do that. Give him the opportunity. If it fails, if we come to an impasse, then you put this kind of motion on the floor and you vote on it. And then you have people, then you'll see who's supporting a strike and who's not supporting a strike. As it turns out now, there's information coming saying that people who vote against this motion support a strike. That is ridiculous. I don't know one person here that supports a strike. But I'm not saying the same that everybody here is going to vote for this motion. Because as far as I'm concerned, we should do this if mediation fails. Not to say right now we're going to preempt this before they go into the last critical thing. And then I find it funny that the union puts a deadline on when they're going to strike. Made it very clear. We will strike 12:01 Monday. Well, then why are they now coming to us? And it's not specific to the union, but why are they now saying, we want you to remove our strike mandate by agreeing to binding arbitration? You say, I'm going to strike one day. Next day you say, remove that strike. No, not even the next day. In the same communication, that's what it said. 12 o'clock, we're going to strike. We want you to remove our mandate to strike. If that's the case, why not say, if mediation fails, would the MLAs consider binding arbitration? I think that would be a no-brainer. Every MLA in this House would support that type of motion. Not every MLA wants to trip the process up halfway through or close to the end. Nobody really knows how close we are. We could be very close to an agreement. We don't know. We're not privy to that information. What we're privy to is communications. I'm not happy with some of the communications that come from the government, and I'm not happy with some of the communication come from the union. But I do think that people shouldn't strike. I do think that the government should make an agreement with the union. It's for the betterment of the people that work for the public service. That's a big group of people. There's 4,000 people out there that are a part of the union that could be walking out on Monday. Don't walk out. Don't ask us to remove your mandate, and don't walk out. But I think the lines have been drawn in the sand as far as I'm concerned. I am concerned about a couple of things, and that's communications. When we started to engage in this process, I found it funny that the union felt that they communicated to the government that binding arbitration was something that the union had asked for. They were very detailed in what they said, that the mediator in 2 different tables, that 2 different mediators went back and forth to the government to ask for binding arbitration, verbally. And if that wasn't good enough, then I think the people negotiating on behalf of the government should have said, that's not good enough, put it in writing. Because that's what it came down to. It was not good enough. It should have been put in writing right away. Or the government should have said, hey, these guys have come forward. We're going to bring this up to the minister. This is what the union has said. They're offering binding arbitration at 2 tables. It's verbal. What should we do? Ask for it in writing. If I was the minister, that's what I would say. Ask for it in writing. That would be the first thing I would say if that came to me. So I think the communication there's something to be said about the way that communication has gone. This is a key tool, binding arbitration. It's not in the Public Service Act, but it's a key tool. It's a tool that can be used in a worst-case scenario. And that's what it should be used for. But today, if this motion does not pass, and I don't think it will, I'm sitting in the committee room with the regular members. If this motion does not pass, this motion cannot come back to the House on Monday. When we need it most, Mr. Speaker, when we need it most, we're not going to be able to use this motion. And that's why I have a problem with it. It's put me I'm in a quandary. Because for me, I would say I should vote for this motion. I should. Because this is my last chance. It's my last chance to actually put this motion. It would have been nice if this motion was necessary, and I'm not saying it will be, if this motion was necessary, that it comes out on Monday. If there is a strike, then this motion comes out on Monday. And I think the union would have gladly pulled back the strike if this motion came out. And binding arbitration basically means that both the union members and the government will put their faith in an arbitrator, and the arbitrator will make a decision. I'm still not 100% sure if the arbitrator is mandated to pick one of the two positions or something in the middle. I don't know 100% what would happen there. For me, failing motion on arbitration does absolutely no good at all. Nothing. It does nothing. It does nothing to advance the process. I want a tool like this. This is a big tool for us, a big tool for the union and a big tool for the government. It should be used when it's critical, not preemptive. I will not support the motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. To the motion, member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as has been stated, this motion, if successful, would not require the GNWT or NTPC to enter into binding arbitration. The Minister of Finance has already stated that because mediation is scheduled to begin today, the government will not consider binding arbitration. Further, if this motion is defeated, it may actually embolden Cabinet's position. I want to make this clear because some of the people who've contacted me seem to believe that this motion represents a silver bullet, but that isn't the case. And I apologize to those whose expectations have been raised. While I agree with much of what Mr. Beaulieu said, especially regarding the wisdom of bringing this motion forward at this point, the fact is that it is before us. And if it has any utility, it's that it's promoting a level of dialogue among residents that I've never seen in my time as an MLA. I've heard from as many constituents in the past 2 days as I usually hear from in 6 months. Some are eager to place blame for the ongoing impasse, alleging bad faith bargaining or ego-driven negotiating by one side or the other. However, Mr. Speaker, most of those who've contacted me believe that both the GNWT's and the UNW's leadership share the responsibility for this ongoing failure. There's dismay at the fact that not only were collective agreements not in place prior to the previous agreements expiring, but that for years, teams of well-paid, professional negotiators haven't been able to find enough common ground to reach a deal. There's confusion as to why in all of 2017, 2018, and 2019, the GNWT and UNW have been at the bargaining or mediation table a total of 9 days. And there's concern that the UNW's push for binding arbitration and the GNWT's proactive counseling of how to cross a picket line are indications that neither side is prepared or expecting to reach a deal this weekend. Mr. Speaker, it has become clear to me that our residents have lost faith in the abilities of the powers that be on both sides to do what is necessary to avoid a strike. The importance of avoiding a strike, Mr. Speaker, cannot be overstated. The effects of the Town of Hay River's 2015 strike are still being felt to this day. There were 31 employees involved in that job action. A GNWT and NTPC strike would be of a much greater magnitude and could take an incalculable toll on residents who rely on government services, on unionized employees and their families, on small businesses and their employees, and for our community as a whole. The results of a prolonged strike would be nothing short of catastrophic. Don't get me wrong, Mr. Speaker, I would like nothing more than for both sides to do what they're paid to do and come to an agreement. It's always preferable to have the relevant parties involved in the decision-making, especially in this case, where the decisions made will have far-reaching effects on the future of our territory. However, the potential consequences of a strike are far too great to leave this process in the hands of parties who have continuously proved themselves incapable of compromise. As I said earlier, I've heard from many constituents, and regardless of why they think we're in this situation, they have all had the same message for me: support this motion and encourage the government to enter into binding arbitration, and I'm doing just that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. To the motion, member for Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is one of the most difficult things I have been asked to decide since being elected. From the beginning, my position has been clear and concise. The government needs to get back to the table and negotiate with the Union of Northern Workers. I believe in the collective bargaining process. Mr. Speaker, the GNWT and the Union of Northern Workers have been involved in a difficult bargaining process since 2016. It has been in the mediation for some time, and we are now at the point where the union has given strike notice. This is a serious and extremely stressful event for all involved, and even for the NWT residents who are not directly involved. The stakes are very, very high. This is about the workers, the government, and most importantly, the residents of the Northwest Territories. It is not a win-lose situation here. It is about people's lives. These pressures are an unfortunate side effect of collective bargaining when the parties do not readily reach agreement. It is getting down to the wire. Right now, those of us on the sideline have to accept that the pressure is part of the process. The pressure focuses the parties to face up on the consequences of failure to get a deal. Mr. Speaker, it has been a while, but as we speak in this House, the parties are in the process of returning to the negotiation table with the help of a skilled mediator. The GNWT and the Government of Northern Workers are very lucky to have one of the best mediators in the business, Vince Reddy, to help them this weekend. Both parties asked for him to do the mediation. Remember that. Both parties asked for him. I did not want to take action that might distract the parties from doing their absolute best to get a deal. We should have had the faith in everybody to do this job, their job, and let the process proceed with dignity. I am assuming that it will be good faith and positive results. Mr. Speaker, I've had the opportunity to sit in meetings with the Union of Northern Workers and the Government of Northwest Territories to hear both sides. I thought we were very, very close in reaching an agreement this weekend. That was my personal opinion, Mr. Speaker. But in the event the parties do not reach an agreement this weekend, it is very likely that Mr. Reddy will recommend a way forward. He will be laser focused on getting constructive results. History shows that he is very astute and resourceful in this regard. If Mr. Reddy does need to make recommendations, the GNWT and UNW will again be faced with some very important choices. This is a process laid out in the Public Service Act, and that is the process that should have been followed, be allowed to unfold. No one wants a strike. I especially don't want a strike. Strike hurts everybody in the NWT. I believe everybody needs to respect the collective bargaining process. So why are members of this House now trying to get involved with the process? Why are we considering a motion that calls on both sides to give up the right to bargain when there's still negotiating to be done? Simple answer, Mr. Speaker, politics. We're feeling the pressure from both sides. And I'll stand up and say that. We're here because it's political now. I believe that both parties were heading into mediation this weekend in good faith. Yes, the UNW was the first to put the pressure on by giving strike notice for midnight on Sunday. To me, this is part of the process. Then we saw the government jump in by suggesting directly or indirectly that it would welcome unionized employees back to work if there was a strike. I did not believe I didn't agree with this, but I figured this was, again, part of the process. Getting information out there, sharing things out there. Mr. Speaker, I respect what my colleagues are trying to do with this motion. I know Ms. Green has been through a strike, and I know all of us remember the painful events that happened in Yellowknife in the early 1990s. This is scary stuff. Mr. Speaker, I had a question to the timing of this motion. I was sincerely hoping the parties would reach an agreement over the weekend, or at least agree on a way forward. That may or may not include binding arbitration. But I see this motion circumvents the process and puts our cabinet colleagues into a corner. I felt it was turning up the pressure on parties this weekend, and rather than let them negotiate in good faith. My colleague, Mr. Bolio, talked about allowing the process to go forward and then using this motion later on. And that's what I was hoping. I wonder why we would expect our cabinet colleagues to both support this motion and then go into mediation in good faith. I want the public to understand, if this motion passes, cabinet is not bound by it. If it fails, our rules stop us from considering a similar motion against next week. Then, when it might actually do some good. I believe this motion would take energy and focus away from the bargaining table and bringing it into political realm. Mr. Speaker, I look back into history, and in 1996, this Legislative Assembly changed the Public Service Act to eliminate binding arbitration. They did this at the urging of the UNW, who wanted to restore the right to take job action. I felt this motion would revisit that history. Has anyone thought about the implications of this on an ongoing basis? If we open the door to binding arbitration now, it may doom all future collective bargaining to the same fate. How would we expect either party to compromise and work together in the future? Some may think that it wouldn't be a precedent. I think we may have to think about this again. Mr. Speaker, how can we ask the government to give up the right to negotiate in the best interest of people in NWT? How can we ask the union to give up their right to strike? This is what binding arbitration does. In saying it again, Mr. Speaker, no one wants to strike, but the right to strike is a fundamental part of the collective bargaining process in a free democracy. The risk of all parties of a strike is what keeps them at the table. It's what caused them to compromise. It's the lubrication in the collective bargaining process. Mr. Speaker, if this motion were up for debate next week, I'd full-heartedly support it. I was hoping this week end the process where both parties would have control over their own actions and outcomes, and where both parties have a lot at stake if an agreement can't be reached. Mr. Speaker, I'm encouraging both parties to stop the posturing, stop the nonsense, stop the thin, veiled threats, and take advantage of this weekend to walk a few feet in each other's shoes. It often said that the sign of a good agreement is where everyone walks away wishing they could have got more. If both sides are willing to compromise, I am confident an agreement is within reach. My position has been clearly and consistent, Mr. Speaker. I wanted the parties to sweat it out at the negotiation table. There's a lot at stake. The whole territory is depending upon you. Let's get a deal done. Unfortunately, last night, I saw the waiver forms given out by the GNWT to YK employees to sign if they decide to walk across the picket line. My frustration was why did this waiver form get sent out a day before the mediation process started? I've asked the government to keep me informed on the process, but I got a surprise last night. Because of all the news and from both sides, I question if we will see an agreement this weekend. The motion says the Assembly calls on the government of the Northwest Territories to agree to enter into a binding arbitration before the scheduled strike begins. We're not asking for binding arbitration to start now. We're asking if it fails and stop before a strike. Therefore, I will be supporting the motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. To the motion, member for Nunakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate all the words of my colleagues up until now, and I just want to say that, Mr. Speaker, this motion to place binding arbitration before the mediation is not taking the proper steps in the first place, and I think what has happened here is we're tripping up the negotiators as they walk into the negotiating room, and that, Mr. Speaker, is unfair. And actually, what it is, it's a lack of confidence, both the government of Northwest Territories and the UNW. So I think this is kind of a double-edged sword that has been put upon us. I think, Mr. Speaker, we need to look at how we do things in the territory, and also I think there's a level of interference, a level of political interference into this that we're really pushing people. And what has come to, Mr. Speaker? I've had a lot of calls from 95% of my constituents that have called or worried that they want to continue to work no matter what happens. Mr. Speaker, I've had phone calls and from maybe 5 other constituencies, 5 other ridings in the territory as well too, with the same concern. As many of us here represent small communities, it's a small community of people that are worried that this will affect their ability to work to continue getting a paycheck and continue to do the work that they are doing. Some of them work with children. Some of them work with children in schools, in daycares, and they're worried that their program dollars may come to a halt, which is sometimes when you're helping with children in their education, it has negative effects to that. It's like somebody getting up and walking out on you in the middle of a school year. Basically, that's what it is, and that's how they see it. Mr. Speaker, I won't reiterate what some of my colleagues have said, but I believe the actions up until now are leading to something that's something that's blown out of proportion. This morning, as I woke up, and I thought, holy cow, somebody was holding the grenade, and someone just pulled the pin this morning, and here we are. It's blowing up on everybody, and we need to look at this and say, well, maybe there needs to be a process moving forward, and if we can't allow the professionals, the negotiators to do their job, then what are we questioning? Does this say that we might need to change the negotiators that we have with the government and also the negotiators with the UNW? Is that, after 3 years of not negotiating, this is meant to expire in March, does that mean that everybody wants those negotiators to be changed and we put a new negotiator so that we can have a better future of the Northwest Territories rather than this division? I see the fracture. And it's getting bigger and bigger, Mr. Speaker, and I have a lot of worried constituents. I respect both sides. The unions I've worked with unions and with the North Warning System, and they're some of the highest paid people in the territory and probably in the country as well too, Mr. Speaker. I think we need to look at the cost of living in the North, the cost of living for communities, for harvesters, for people who don't have a voice to speak for themselves. I look at the number of union members that are pushing for this. It's less than half. It's far less than half of the amount of union members in the territory. For me, that's a huge sign saying, okay, well, we need to rethink of this. Maybe we need to meet with the executive. The legislature may need to meet with the executive of the Northwest Territories and look at a way forward and maybe meet something. And maybe the union members across the territory need to unite and look at what's important for them as well too, and then maybe it takes a second round to get a true voice of what really is going on in the territory and what are the needs of the people that are worried about this strike. We also need to, Mr. Speaker, when we look at this, we need to look at the economy of the Northwest Territories. There's a number of mines that are on the last, they don't have 10 years left, and what's next for that? I saw a post this morning and it said, what now? What's the way forward for everybody here? I think we need to really think long and hard about that. And coming from a small community, I see us struggling as the way it is right now. And for us to give this much to a union that's asking for so much, I think there's an imbalance there. I think that's something we need to really consider when we look at these negotiations and appreciate it. There's 44,000 people in Northwest Territories, Mr. Speaker. What about them? I think we need to really look at that and look at regions, the high cost of living, the high cost of transportation. I think those are all key factors in all of this, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of groups that will be affected in the Northwest Territories, and I'm speaking from an Indigenous perspective. Recently, I was involved with work with Indigenous groups, and I still am. And Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of Indigenous groups in the Northwest Territories that have co-management agreements with the government in the Northwest Territories. If we go into a strike, that will affect the kind of work that they're doing nationally, internationally, laterally with government-to-government relationships, and I think we really need to kind of stand back and say it has a much bigger effect than we think than just the union. It has an effect on Indigenous groups and Indigenous governments in the Northwest Territories who are talking about, Mr. Speaker, impacts on co-management in Inuvialuit Settlement region and other regions, also impacts the rest of the Northwest Territories as a lot of wildlife resources are shared in the NWT, along with Nunavut, the Yukon, and Alaska, Mr. Speaker. Of particular importance is required polar bear surveys, which is a minimum 3 years research program. It provides vital information that leads to effective co-management of a species that is very important to the Inuvialuit, the Inuit, Canada, and the entire polar range states in the Arctic, Mr. Speaker. There's 5 Arctic states in the circumpolar world. What about them as well too? I think we need to look more broad and really see the effects, the negative effects of what's really going on here, or what could possibly happen. That's why I say someone pulled a pin on the grenade this morning, and it's really blown up. For us to come here to this point to debate about something like this that shouldn't have happened until Monday or Tuesday or sometime next week. If we do go, if the union goes on strike, then this would be an effective tool. But right now, we're taking away the strengths and the abilities of the people that are hired to negotiate this and negotiate it fairly. This is there's not many options other than what we have right now, Mr. Speaker. So I think we're losing those options. We're narrowing it down to the point where there's nowhere to go. We're simply cornering people who need to do their job to represent people in Northwest Territories, and I believe that's very strongly, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think we should allow the mediation to happen in good faith. I know both sides want a deal, like the member from Tunade-Willowday said earlier. How close are we? We don't know. But there are some things in every government, in every relationship, whether it's with Indigenous governments or other countries, even though you may not be working at the surface, Mr. Speaker, there are some working relationships in there, and I think that's where the union and the government of Northwest Territories really need to grasp onto to strengthen those. And I believe that's a good working point. And I think all we could do is encourage them to do their best this weekend and come up with something that's agreeable to the people of the Northwest Territories. And I think that we owe that to them, Mr. Speaker. I really believe so. Otherwise, Mr. Speaker, if this, entering our binding arbitration, Mr. Speaker, next we'll have to find an arbitrator that is willing to take this on. And I bet you the way the things are, the atmosphere in the territory right now is there aren't many out there, Mr. Speaker. So we need to think about that as well too. So, Mr. Speaker, for that matter, I won't be supporting this motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. To the motion, member for Decho.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the mover and the seconder for presenting this motion to the floor of the House. Mr. Speaker, I will not support this motion. As a regular MLA, I try my best to work with everyone. Right now, we're being led by the Premier, Cabinet, and ministers that make decisions for all residents of the Northwest Territories. I understand as regular MLAs, and along with Cabinet, we are the principals that are driving this negotiations process. And periodically, we hear from the negotiators in terms of representing the union and the GNWT. And that's the negotiations process that we've seen thus far. As I understand it, the GNWT is a system of people, policies and procedures, and fiscal resources. In considering the operations of this government, once in a while we come across issues, whether it be fiscal, whether it be policies or procedures, and sometimes people that want their concerns to be addressed. And what we're seeing now as part of that process, that people want better wages, better benefits, and better hope for their futures in terms of working in the Northwest Territories. But the two parties have determined a collective bargaining process, and they're involved with that process, and they agree to that process. This motion is essentially asking us to intervene, to take a side, and to see an arbitration process kick in. And of course, we're all experiencing the pressure from all sides. But for me, what's critical is the timing of this motion. At this point, we're poised to see the mediation process perhaps in the final stages, and there could be an attempt to try to mediate an agreement. There's a process in place for negotiations. This negotiations has been going on for some time, and we're at the mediation stage. I'd like to strongly encourage both parties to come to an agreement to ensure that an agreement will give assurances to everyone that everyone is a winner. Must say, Mr. Speaker.
To the motion, Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank all of my colleagues who have gotten up and spoken today. I tried to choose my words carefully, as I know that a lot of people are listening, watching, or will read what happens in the House here today. I'm proud of my Yellowknife colleagues for bringing this motion forward, and I'm pleased to support it. Our constituents, indeed all the residents of the Northwest Territories, deserve to know where we stand on this motion. This is the defining moment and the biggest test we face in the 18th Assembly. I believe in collective bargaining and acknowledge that the mediation is occurring right now as we speak. I urge both sides to come prepared and hope for a successful outcome. However, the Union of Northern Workers has formally offered and requested binding arbitration. We haven't responded. This is the off-ramp for what is now a very risky and serious situation. There is no other plan and no other process if negotiations fail. We need to do everything we can to prevent a strike, and binding arbitration will do that. There are no legal barriers to binding arbitration, and the parties can set whatever conditions they want on that process, including timelines, the scope of the arbitrator, salary increment ranges, you name it. There's lots of experience to draw on. Of all the issues during my time as an MLA, this one has brought forward the most emails, phone calls, and conversations. The messages are not some cookie-cutter campaign, but very sincere, often expressing frustration and desperation with the position of this government and the impacts a strike will have. I've worked very hard to avoid a strike and all that will bring, much of which we cannot predict. But we all know it will be bad, very bad. I will never forget the sights and sounds of sirens heading out to Giant Mine in 1992 and 1993. That terrible strike tore Yellowknife apart, and the scars are still here. The strike at CBC was also very painful. How ironic that we are on the cusp of our first ever territorial government-wide employee strike 27 years later, and 4 kilometers away from Giant Mine, yet appear to have learned so little from that infamous and tragic episode in our history. Those of us in this House have little influence over what the Union of Northern Workers does, but when I've been contacted and met with representatives, I've urged moderation and a focus on getting a deal at the negotiating table. I do not condone some of the recent events of this week. What we do have some influence over as regular MLAs, and indeed a duty to act, is to attempt to work with our colleagues in Cabinet to bring these negotiations to a successful conclusion before a strike. I'm disappointed and distressed that Cabinet has done very little to de-escalate the situation, and more recently has inflamed it with deliberately provocative communications and actions. As MLAs, we must know what is going on, ask tough questions, and have input into decisions. That's not interference in any sense of the word. That's our job as MLAs. I should have demanded sooner to have some meaningful input into the UN negotiations mandate. I don't need or want to be at the table, but I should know what is going on and what the range of the offer will be. Cabinet has never sought our input on the negotiations mandate, let alone told us what is in the mandate of the negotiators. That mandate has largely been framed by Cabinet's fiscal strategy that I have disagreed with at every opportunity. I called on the Minister of Finance to ensure that our negotiators have a mandate to offer binding arbitration at the table if the negotiations are not successfully concluded during this mediation. I have not received any assurances that the negotiators' mandate includes binding arbitration, and thus have very little confidence in Cabinet's current approach. My confidence was shaken even further late yesterday upon hearing and seeing that some GNWT supervisors are distributing an employee acknowledgement and waiver form for crossing picket lines. Employees would acknowledge that they are making a free decision to cross a picket line and that they will not hold GNWT responsible for anything that may happen. In the labor world, this is union busting and deliberately provocative. This action from our government came after regular MLAs specifically requested in writing that the minister refrain from such actions. Clearly, Cabinet has not listened to regular MLAs and has ignored our advice yet again. Everything I've tried with this Cabinet on this issue has failed. This situation is now spiraling out of control. A strike will change us all, and those divisions have already started. Yellowknife and the regional centres will feel the initial brunt of a strike, but make no mistake, those impacts will certainly spread out across the entire Northwest Territories. This is not the legacy that any of us should want. While this motion is not binding, the Premier and this Cabinet have the ability to avoid a disruptive and divisive strike at this point. I implore you, I beg you, I plead with you to turn this around now and show the leadership the Northwest Territories needs. The risk of a strike are just too big. Stop the provocative actions, live up to the leadership you're entrusted with, and agree to binding arbitration now. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. To the motion, member for Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this motion is somewhat premature, as we have been told. This should have been done next week if we needed to. Now this motion cannot be brought up again during this session. Cabinet is put in a lose-lose situation. If Cabinet votes for this motion, they will be seen as negotiating in bad faith at the negotiating table. Also, if they don't support the motion, they will and have already been labeled as not supporting our employees, which is far from the truth. I will support this motion, but it is very difficult to, after how our Premier was treated by union members at his constituency meeting on Tuesday night. That was bullying at its finest, Mr. Speaker. Let's hope this never happens again. Now to the negotiations. It seems we may have hard negotiators on both sides that aren't willing to complete negotiations. If that's the case, we need to change negotiators on both sides, and remember, we have a common interest. Mr. Speaker, every one of my constituents that have reached out to me, all don't want to strike. Many of them just want to continue working and provide for their families, as we have the second highest cost of living in the Northwest Territories. Just to be clear, the somewhat threatening email we've all received yesterday from the union had nothing to do with my decision. At first, I wasn't going to support this motion, as it should have taken place next week if we needed to. Although it would be perceived that we don't support our employees if we don't support the motion. Let us work together to ensure we reach a fair deal for our government employees. Our residents of the Northwest Territories rely upon us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. To the motion, member for Inuvik Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, appreciate the debate that's going on in this assembly. I've had a lot of people reach out to me as well, constituents of Inuvik Twin Lakes, a lot of families worried about the strike. And what I want people to understand, that just because you don't support the motion, and I think a couple of members have already said it, just because you don't support the motion, you're not voting in favor of a strike. Let's make that perfectly clear, and people need to understand that. I have a lot of confidence in the ability of our negotiators, the UNW's negotiators, to think about the people that have been emailing us, talking about the hardships that they might face if they have to go on strike. And none of them want to. None of us want them to go on strike. They're talking about the hardship, and it's that mindset that we should take into the mediation this weekend, thinking about those particular people. And I believe that we would be able to come to an agreement. One of the members over there said it perfectly well, said that there was a lot of politics involved. I totally agree. I totally agree. I've had a few emails, some from threatening on October 1st. I mean, that's fine. We're all MLAs. every year we go through an election period and we have people say why they won't support us. That's fine. But it's put in what I don't like as Dean of the House and the one that's been here the longest. What I don't appreciate is the pressure that is put on all 19 of us. I don't appreciate that because we have people that we have tasked to do our negotiating, and the pressure that is put on all 19 members of this House, I absolutely do not appreciate. It put everyone in a difficult position where, I think Mr. Blake said it, it's lose-lose for everybody on which way you go with this. And that is something that I'm not a big fan of. We have, our folks are before a mediator this weekend. Let's let them do as we task them. I've heard members say that this is something that should have happened next week. I agree. But again, political pressure and how some react to it is different in a lot of people. And I want people to be rest assured that I will be available. I'm going to make myself available all weekend. And I'm going to try to be in constant communication with everybody to see if we can go through the successful mediation. A member from Trinidad, Williday, said it really well when he said communication. He said communication. And that's something that sometimes we're often criticized for, the communication part of the work we do. And I've heard that. I've had meetings with the regular members, deep conversations on where we need to go. But I don't think there's a person in the Northwest Territories that wants a strike. Because you vote against the motion doesn't mean you're supporting a strike. And again, I really take offense to the pressure that is put on all my colleagues in this assembly. It's this undue pressure. We have people that we have tasked to negotiate on our behalf. The union has people that are tasked to negotiate on their behalf. And I think the backdrop of those negotiations should be how it's going to affect people in the Northwest Territory. And with that backdrop, then I think we can reach an agreement. And Mr. Speaker, somebody was, one of the members said, well, you know, the minister is going to tell us, let's respect the process. I've been saying that for a while, and let's respect the process. But I also have faith and respect the principle of the people that are in the process, that they're going to take the best interest of people across the Northwest Territories in mind while they're sitting and having their back and forth. And I will trust them to do that. Failing that, then they will come up with probably the next step in the resolution of this. I'm not sure what that would include, but again, they're negotiating for their membership, and we're negotiating. So again, I will leave that up to them. But I will be available all weekend, and because we believe in the concept of mediation and the folks that are involved in it, Cabinet is not going to be supporting the motion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. At this point in time, I'll allow the mover to conclude her remarks on the motion.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to start by saying that I appreciate the positions that my colleagues have taken. I think some of them I don't agree with, but I appreciate their efforts to make themselves understood. Mr. Speaker, make no mistake, this is a political discussion, and we are making a political decision. This is a place in which politics happens, and we are here to demonstrate leadership in the most pressing issue facing our territory at this time. It is my take on my role that I can express this leadership by forwarding this motion. From a legal point of view, we have been advised by people who are lawyers that the fact that there is no binding arbitration in the Public Service Act is not an impediment to entering into binding arbitration. It is one of the options, and it's important to note that the minister has not said that binding arbitration can't happen. He simply hasn't said anything about it. Where I'm at now is that I've lost confidence that the process that we're engaged in now is going to produce a result that both sides will accept, and that it will result in no strike action on Monday. The timing of this motion is related to the soonest possible that we could debate it. And this is not a stunt. I think if there's one thing that I've been impressed by today is the sincerity with which people hold their beliefs. This is not a game. We're not playing poker here. We're talking about the future of our territory and the people who live in it. And the stakes are incredibly high. I want to say that the timing of the motion, I recognize that the motion is non-binding. It wouldn't matter if we had the motion today or Monday or next week or any other time. The effect of the motion is to give advice to the government, and they are not obliged to act on it. I understand that, but I still feel that I need to provide that advice. I reject the idea that we are in any way interfering in the current process. Mediation is happening now. I hope that it continues and is productive, but we have to think in terms of what happens next. As my colleague from Frame Lake said, we need the off-ramp. We need the off-ramp in place before the highway runs out. I know that there are people here, my colleagues here, who want to talk themselves out of the political leadership that they were elected to demonstrate, and I will leave that to them and their constituents to sort out. Mr. Speaker, I would finally just say that I have a history in this House of doing what's right and not necessarily what's popular. I've been on the losing end of motions before, and I am prepared to be on that, in that position today, because I sincerely believe that we need to do everything possible to avert a strike and its disastrous consequences. And with that, I'd like to request a recorded vote. I'll see.
Massey. Member has requested a recorded vote. All those in favor, please stand.
Member for Yellowknife Centre. Member for Hay River North. The member for Mackenzie Delta. The member for Cam Lake. The member for Nahende. The member for Frame Lake.
All those against, please stand.
Member for Deschaux, the member for Nunakput, the member for Inuvik Boot Lake, the member for Range Lake, the member for Great Slave, the member for Yellowknife South, the member for Inuvik Twin Lakes, the member for Hay River South, the member for Tabacha, the member for Satu, the member for Yellowknife North.
All those abstain, please stand.
The member for Tunada-Welladay.
The results of the recorded vote: all in favor, 6. All opposed is 11. Abstention, 1. The motion is defeated. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole of Bills and Other Matters. Minister Statement 131-18 bracket 3, table document 322-18 bracket 3, with member for Hay River North in a chair.
I now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Bolio?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that the chair rise and report progress.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. There's a motion to report progress. The motion is in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will rise and report progress. Thank you.
May I have the report, Member Hay River North?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sorry about the confusion. Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering Minister Statement 131-18 brackets 3 and Table Document 322-18 brackets 3. I would like to report progress, and Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
Merci. Do I have a seconder? Member for Inuvik Twin Lakes. Motions on the floor, motions in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Merci. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Madam Clerk, orders of the day.
Indadze edani legedi ha wek eati. Ed sanakwaza huno datso itle 2019 itle tai. Hayat eti Gawode hayati eketet sodo hayati indi gawode dawet inke inle gotson nagode haton goga gekwe gizi hat edi asi wekedzon at ehi gawode daget eke nitleta da et eke indi nitleta da et inke inle gotson nagogede. Commissioner Weatik e hayat eti sumba nawo wek e hayati didze klon didze to going zit a asit eke standing aid so special committee to amigo di wetso nawo de wego ginda wego di donate ala nitle giga da ra negele. Nawo wek edzon ra yati nit a aqueslo nawo nitle wek edzon ra hat edi nawo hotle aqueslo nawo nitle wek eati bill 34 nank e son nawo nitle wek eati nawont ala wero flegeti ho Minister Statement 131-18.3 Table Document 322-18.3 Edani legedi wehon hagedi taitson nawo nitle wek eati indaidze edani legeti ha wek eati.
Merci, Madam Clerk. This House stands adjourned till Monday, February 11, 2019 at 1:30 p.m.